If you're a student, faculty member, a staff member, or someone from our general public, we want to welcome you to our second presentation of the 30th anniversary celebration year of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. While we continue here, I wanted to let you know that if you're a Sun Devil Rewards Act member, go ahead and check in on the app for 25 points and use a secret word that we have, all one word, thanks to the ADA. And you'll get another 100 points. So thanks to the ADA, secret word for Sun Devil Reward members. We'll start here in just a second. All right. Hello, my name is Peter Fisher. I'm the Accessibility Compliance Coordinator at ASU. I'm in the Office of the University Architect here at Arizona State University. Today I'm going to be your MC. I'll introduce the speakers and their topics, and they will be telling you all about the history of the ADA from predated ADA before 30 years ago till into the future. And we'll see what we can have for that as well. We wanted to let you know that this is a series of activities for the 30th anniversary of the ADA. So throughout the 2020 and 2021 academic year, pretty much every month we're going to have an event that's a different activity or different participation, somehow either Zoom or maybe in public. Maybe we'll get to see each other again sometime soon. Look ahead in October. The Student Recreation Office will be doing an adaptive sports activity. They're going to highlight a bunch of different adaptive sports that are all based on different disability types. So keep an eye out for that. And in early 2021, our Human Relations Department will do a lecture on accessibility in the employment settings. So when you're at work. This afternoon, we're focusing on the history of the ADA. Therefore, I'll be introducing you to our panelists. Those of you here this evening will get to experience all the knowledge that they get to share with us. To start it off, I have a fellow colleague of mine, Dan Demlin. Dan, would you give us a start and begin this presentation?
Well, welcome everyone. I'm proud to be part of this. My name is Dan Demlin. I am a design manager in the Office of the University Architect here at ASU. I'm approaching my 43rd year of practice as an architect, and I've sat on for 7 years on the Mayor's Commission for Disability Issues in Phoenix. Pete and I go back a long ways, almost 20 years doing this. And today I'm going to be speaking a little bit about the history of ADA here in the state of Arizona, and a little bit with ASU as well. I am the consummate Sun Devil, and as you can see, ADA, even though before it was law, it was something that we practiced here at ASU, and many of us within the community of practitioners in design, we look at stuff like this as you, hey, Pete, go back to that last slide. You can see here, we've got an early building that certainly predates my years here and connected to ASU. You can see that even then we were doing ramps and opening the community to all the disabled people. That at that time of this practice, it was very, very unique. At the time, as we move forward, go on to the next slide, Pete. You can see that this was about the early 80s on the next slide. You can see some of the people there as part of the disabled students resources. And I'm thinking this is about the 80s, late 80s or so, Pete. Correct me if I'm wrong, but even back then with that, we need to understand that ADA, when it was first passed in '88, and I had the chance as a member of the American Institute of Architects to discuss this at our Government Affairs Commission, we didn't get a chance to use that first ADAG document very much. As one of my colleagues, the late Bob Lynch, said, we never got to test drive it. And in '90, when it was rolled out, we found some kind of tough flaws to work with. And in '94, it was then re-released after it went back through rules to be looked at again. And we realized that we were getting it there, but it's still not quite 100% there. Shortly after that, Arizona attempted to make their own what we call ASDAG document. It was the Arizona Accessibility Americans for Disability Act guidelines. And after about 2 years of work, we had all that work done. They took it before GERC, which is the governor's body that reviews rules. And unfortunately, it died there. So we never did adopt the ASDAG document, even though the federal government had placed the shoulders of enforcement on the states. So we were basically using this older document. Then along come around, I want to say the early 2000s, middle 2000s, they started to update that using the basis of that, the ANSI, ANSI 2010. As you can see here, as I'm talking about that, this particular photo of this wonderful van that we had, if you notice, we had a Sun Devil logo in the wheelchair. You notice how that the Sun Devil's leaning forward is very similar to the new dynamic look of the 2018, 2017 ANSI, where the new international logo is much more dynamic. I really, when Pete showed me this, I'd love to have this brought back and see us using it more, because it shows even back then we were so progressive. All the way at the turn of the century, we're now getting back into it. But the latest 2010 document was finally passed. The whole purpose of that one was to give us a uniform approach for all practices in the built environment. And I don't think we're ever going to see us go back trying to create an Arizona document like that, because the ANSI document right now is updated every 3 years, even though the ADA standards takes a little longer, being the federal government. But we start to see that the built environment is being affected very heavily by ADA now, even in our design school and our design testing. If you move on to the next slide there, Pete, we at ASU, we've got the darts, and you see the darts going all over the campus now. And when I first joined ASU a year ago, it was new to me to see that. And you start to see how the DRC is really reaching out to the community of the disabled. And then of course we get our little high-tech off-road vehicle like this. I told Pete one day, I got to try this. I can just imagine how much fun it is to maneuver around the campus and some of the hiking trails. We are moving very, very far. And so as you can see in the 30 years from the time that started, ASU and the state of Arizona have in many ways led the development of this. And I'm very proud to be part of that here at ASU as part of the Office of the University Architect and as a specialist in ADA.
So Dan,
with that, Pete?
So Dan, before we move on, tell us a little bit about what the state of Arizona was doing before the ADA became law in 1992-ish, depending on when you count the date it's signed. If you let us know what you knew about it back then as an architect and a designer, what came up back in those days or before those days along the state of Arizona's rules.
So I think the first time that I ever had the opportunity to address ADA was in 1988. I think that was one of the first presentations of the legislation to Congress. I believe at that time it was being entertained by the House and on the Government Affairs Commission. And while I sat there at that point in my career, I had not been a registered architect yet. I was still an apprentice. and I was known in AIA as an associate member. And I had the ability of being the only associate member on the GAC, the Government Affairs Commission. And I can remember us discussing much of that in those meetings. One of the biggest things I remember being heard in those discussions was the fact that there's huge potential for abuses, that things would be misused in this. And we didn't, the beautiful thing is we have not seen that happen even with the enforcement now. I think that some people think that it doesn't have a lot of teeth, but I will tell you, the foundation of the ADAG created the ANSI document, and the ANSI document now is part of the building code. So a lot of the stuff that we heard back then, a lot of the reservations, I could say 30 years later, I don't see the abuses. I don't see the things that were talked about there. What I do see is I do see a huge amount of inclusion to our society. I still think we have a place to go, and we need to understand that one of the things as we developed the ADAG document, as the ASDAG document was being built, we need to understand that the goal of ADA was 100% accessibility for 100% of the people, 100% of the time. And that's a utopian view that just can't occur because, as we know, not everyone has the same capabilities who has a disability, even if you're in the same group. As I liken to the wheelchair, if you're confined to a wheelchair by accident versus disease, your capabilities are different. And so what the goal was try and set the standard for the built environment to encompass a larger window, maybe 80% of people, not 100% of people. And yet there's still a lot of language within those requirements that allow me as a designer to customize for the particular local climate or client that I'm designing for. So I've seen a lot of changes over the last 30 years. I think we've made great strides. I still think strides are needed yet, but it's been a wonderful practice of the career. And as I get ready to transfer the baton to the younger people as I'm approaching the final third of my career, I think there's a future here that's very bright, and I can't wait to see what happens.
Thanks, Dan. Next up, we have Phil Pangrazio and April Reed at the Ability 360 Center, and they're going to talk about the independent living movement.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. My name is Phil Pangrazio. I'm CEO of Ability 360, and my colleague, April Reed, will join me here too. She's our Vice President of Advocacy at Ability 360. Great to be with you all. I am a Sun Devil. I am an alum. Started out at ASU in 1981. All those photographs you went through, I've seen them. I feel like I should have been in those photographs, and all those folks that you had picture of Teddy Scharf and Jim Morn was in one of those pictures. The whole staff that were at Disabled Student Services back in the early 1980s were there. So that was kind of a fun look at down memory lane. So you can head to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of independent living and how the independent living movement kind of is a backdrop to to getting to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And so when we talk about independent living and the disability rights movement, we kind of think of these 5 different movements that influenced the disability rights movement. We start out with the deinstitutionalization. Often when we think of that, we think of the investigation at Willowbrook, the state institution hospital in Staten Island, New York, where Geraldo Rivera did a investigative report there, and there were children and young adults just living in deplorable conditions at Willowbrook. It took about 10 years from 1972 to the early 80s to shut down Willowbrook. And again, that was one of the seminal moments of starting the deinstitutionalization movement. Of course, the civil rights movement of African Americans in the 1960s, the self-help movement. We think of a lot of self-help activities were occurring in the 60s and 70s. One even that started earlier than that was, Alcoholics Anonymous, probably one of the more renowned self-help groups, which the independent living movement borrowed a lot from, because it used the peer model, which is so important in the independent living movement. Then demedicalization, I don't know, April's going to talk a little bit about that. And of course, consumerism. And often we think of Ralph Nader and the movement that he started in the 60s and 70s to fight back against corporate kind of malfeasance. So anyway, those, next slide. Also, we think about the history of independent living. The major civil rights laws that kind of set the stage for the ADA. Again, I'm not going to go through these, but the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968, the Urban Mass Transit Act of 1970, the Rehab Act, I know we're going to talk a lot about today, that the different speakers are. IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, the Air Carrier Access Act in 1988, and the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988. So if you think of the civil rights for people with disabilities, it really was, that led to the ADA, it was a very short period of time. And I'm going to turn this over to April to walk us through the independent living paradigm.
Thank you, Phil. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today with all of you. I'm very appreciative of the time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the independent living paradigm, or the independent living model. And this really gave us a tool, a philosophy to help shift from a medical model or a medical perspective of viewing disability to the independent living model. And the shift was really about seeing people with disabilities and seeing opportunities and potential, and moving from the medical model of seeing deficiencies within that individual. And the medical model really focused on the individual, whereas the independent living model said, there's nothing wrong with having a disability or being a person with a disability. We don't have deficiencies. The deficiencies lie within society. That's what needs to change. Next slide, please. And so here's some examples of the differences between the medical paradigm and the independent living paradigm. So the definition of the problem, as I said, in the medical model, it's the individual has something that needs to be fixed. They have the problem. Whereas the independent living paradigm said, no, dependency on others, not having control over our decision-making process, stereotypes, hostile attitudes, barriers in the community, barriers in access in our environment. That's the problem that needs to be fixed. Next slide, please. And it really moved us to think about solutions, right? So the medical model would have said, the only solution is the professional intervention, right? The medical intervention, the doctor, the medications, the treatment plan. That's what will, quote, fix the disability. Again, the independent living paradigm said, no, the solutions are removing barriers in the community, advocacy, self-help, peer mentors, peer role models, and giving and expecting people with disabilities to have control over their own services and their own options of services. Our role shifted, right? So before we were viewed as a patient or a client in the medical model, which was a very disempowering role if you think about it, right? The doctor was making the decision, not the patient. The shift in the IL paradigm was to say that the consumer is the individual with the disability. They're the ones who are using the services, therefore they should have control over it. So the consumer now is taking charge of their own services and is responsible for those outcomes versus the doctor. Next slide, please. And then the desired outcome, not focused on ADLs, not focused on, again, physical or mental aspects of the disability, but the desired outcome under the independent living paradigm was the independence that someone would have through the ability to make their own decisions and to be integrated every day in the community. Next slide, please. Another philosophy that was hugely important for us as we made this shift as a community and made this shift in our advocacy about what we expected, how we expected people to engage with us, was really the idea of independent living philosophy. And kind of the best way that I can describe independent living philosophy to you is that this is the belief that people with disabilities can do anything anyone else can, but we just might have to do it a little bit differently. And that's okay. And so it's not the job of those who are working with me to tell me how to do it, but to listen to my wants and desires, what independent living means to me, and thus create services and programs and opportunities based on my wants and needs. Independent living philosophy demanded that the person with the disability be involved in every decision at every point. It expected personal responsibility, that people with disabilities would be engaged in the decision-making process and that we would be held accountable as a full participant. And independent living philosophy also was cross-disability. So historically, sometimes different disability groups were segregated and kept away from each other. And in independent living centers and in independent living philosophy, we believed in the integration of people with disabilities together so that we could learn from each other and that we could role model and advocate together. And independent living philosophy believed in equal access and full inclusion. Next slide, please. So in recent years, you'll maybe have heard of person-centered planning. This is a big word we hear about. But in independent living philosophy, we've been doing that for a long time. And that was making the person with the disability the center of the work. It's a very strength-based perspective. So I'm a social worker and we use philosophies that are strength-based. That means that when I go into work with somebody with a disability, I'm more interested in their abilities and their strengths. I'm more interested in what they can do and creating opportunities for them based on their own interests and needs. And again, we believe that disability is a natural part of the human experience and that in no way should diminish the individual's right to live independently. Next slide. So we believe that there's no normal. Everyone has a physical or mental or emotional challenge at times. That's part of living and that's normal. And that natural part of living, at some point you're going to experience a disability. We also believe at looking at ability on a continuum. And so every one of us has strengths and weaknesses. And just because I have a weakness in one area does not mean that I have strengths in others. And so a weakness in one area does not require the response of someone to take over every part of your decision making. Every person, every human has strengths and weaknesses, and people with disabilities should be looked at from that same lens, that we can have ability on a continuum. We value self-advocacy and self-determination, and we promote that. And we promote self-advocacy versus compliance or silence. So encouraging people with disabilities to speak up for themselves, to know their rights, to know their civil rights, to demand to be included in the community so that we're not isolated and segregated as we've been in the past as a community. Next slide, please. And again, that the outcome would be that people with disabilities have the opportunity to fully participate in the political, economic, and social life of our community, because that is a basic right. And having a disability is not a reason to deny that right. Next slide, please. So when we talk about the history of independent living, we have to talk about Ed Roberts. And Ed Roberts is who we call the father of independent living. And he became disabled at the age of 14 as a result of polio. And through the advocacy and determination of himself and also his parents, was able to go to school and was able to apply to go to the University of Berkeley. But he was actually denied enrollment originally. And the state rehabilitation office denied it because they said it was, quote, infeasible for him that he would ever work. So you can see that's a clear example, right, of some of the discrimination and some of the stereotypes and barriers that people with disabilities were facing at that time. So Ed Roberts fought that and was able to ultimately enroll in the University of Berkeley, but still faced barriers about the environment. He was not able to live in the dormitory because of the iron lung that he slept in was too heavy for those floors. And so he actually had to live in the infirmary. Think about that, right? A completely different world that students today going to a university dorm will experience. Next slide, please. And so over the years, more individuals with disabilities were admitted to the University of Berkeley. And the leadership there was slowly being convinced that people with disabilities could be students and could be successful. And so what happened was Ed had more roommates, so to speak, join him at the infirmary. And at night they would sit around and talk about their dreams for themselves, but also for others with disabilities. And they kind of formed this group called the Rolling Quads. And the Rolling Quads was able to get a federal grant that helped them establish a program where they could help other students find accessible housing and attendant care. And along with Judy Heumann, ultimately, Ed Roberts started the very first Center for Independent Living in Berkeley, California in 1972. Next slide, please. I will say before I turn it over to Phil, Centers for Independent Living, there's 400 of us nationwide. And so you can see that Ed's efforts paid off for the disability community in this amazing way. So these 400 centers nationwide work with anyone with a disability, and we provide peer support, information referral, individual assistance advocacy, independent living skills training, and transition. So you can see why he's a hero in our community because of the idea, this seed that he had for an idea really has grown into radical change for people with disabilities in the United States. With that, I'll turn it over to Phil.
Great, thank you, April. And that was a great segue. And even I think of when I went to ASU in 1981, you know, and when ASU had the Disabled Student Services Program and they had advocated so strongly for an accessible campus. There were accessible dormitories at ASU when I got there, and that was so important for me to be able to go to college. So the work that Ed Roberts did to lay that foundation, you know, just really was a trailblazer. When we talk about the independent living movement, you kind of have to talk about this Wade Blank and the founding of the Atlantis community that later became a Center for Independent Living up in Denver, Colorado. Wade Blank, he was a Presbyterian minister. He was a civil rights advocate, and he started out as a nursing home recreation director. He was recruited to, it was about 1971, he was recruited to be this nursing home rec director to start some youth programs in the nursing home. And so he did that, and he did a really good job. He was bringing what was kind of like normalization for these young adults living in a nursing home into the nursing home. And he developed some great programs. They loved what he was doing at the nursing home. But then he started moving, but he came to realize that most of these folks with significant physical and intellectual disabilities living in a nursing home didn't need to be there. And so he began moving them out one by one by one. And he was actually providing attendant care, personal assistant services to them. And of course, he couldn't do it, or he was finding attendants in the community to do that for him. Well, once the nursing home found out that he was moving these folks out of the nursing home, well, they fired him. And they were like, hey, wait a minute. These are our most profitable residents in the nursing home. And so he was, in 1974, he got fired. So he went to the city of Denver, and he started, he got a grant to do some subsidized housing, which today would be kind of the equivalent of Section 8 housing vouchers. He got some properties donated, and they became part of the community-based living that he created. Anyway, so after he started moving folks out of nursing homes, he developed. He recognized the need for public transportation if people with disabilities were going to live independently in the community. He helped start this protest in 1978, blocking city buses, and then eventually they established ADAPT, the American Disabled for Accessible Public Transit, which was founded in 1988. And they did a lot of advocacy around making our public transit system accessible. And then later, they changed after they had achieved most of their transit goals, they changed the name of ADAPT to the American Disabled for Attendant Programs today to fight for Medicaid home community-based services. And they're still advocating on that issue to this day. Next slide. And here's a couple photos from some of the advocacy that they were doing in the mid-'80s. You can go to the next slide. I'm not going to get into the details of Section 504 of the Rehab Act, but 504 really, I know Rose is going to talk a lot about it, but it was the ADA before we had an ADA, and so it really, you can't talk about the history of the independent living movement without talking about Section 504 of the Rehab Act. Next slide. And I think I was going to turn this back to you, April, to talk a little bit about Judy Heumann.
Yeah. So Judy Heumann is a very important figure in the disability community, an important activist and advocate. That's the picture of her book that's currently out. So it's a great read if you want to learn a little bit more about civil rights advocacy and the disability community. Judy was, as I said, she worked with Ed Roberts and together they started the first Center for Independent Living. But she was also incredibly important in getting the Section 504 signed. Next slide, please. And so what happened is this was held back and no one signed these regulations. And so until it was signed, it couldn't be implemented. And the disability community was very frustrated, of course, because they looked at this and saw this and said, you're denying us our civil rights and you're delaying our civil rights. And
you
so
know, also, I was going to just throw in, if you think about this, the Section 504 of the Rehab Act started out with President Nixon, went to President Ford, and then it went to President Carter. It went through 3 different presidents before they could actually get it signed.
Yeah, so there's a lot of frustration where people felt the administrations were literally just passing the buck and not doing anything. And so Judy and many other advocates gathered together. And what's important about this is it was one of the first times that the disability community gathered in this way in protest. There were national protests. But the most famous protest was the sit-in that happened at the Department of Health and Education building in San Francisco. And you'll see the pictures here from that protest and that sit-in. And that's where people with disabilities held that building for 28 days. And it gained national attention and finally gained the attention of the administration and ultimately led to the signage of Section 504. But this was the first time that people with disabilities really were this visible in protest and talking about their civil rights. And so, this really empowered our community and motivated people to do more and to fight for more and ultimately to fight for the ADA. Next slide, please. And I think I turn it back over to Phil.
Yeah, and so, when we finally got 504, the rules promulgated, of course, President Reagan came into power, and there was his movement to deregulate a lot of things, including disability rights, which was, a lot of the advocates had to really push back on this in the 1980s. Next slide. And of course, this led to just the work of Justin Dart, who's also often considered the father of the Americans with Disabilities Act. He traveled the country collecting stories about individuals with disabilities that wanted to hear the evidence of folks, the discrimination that was occurring against people with disabilities. So he did this in 1992. He traveled, he met with over 2,000 people. Next slide. And then again, 1988 and 1990, he traveled again across the country. And this led up to the signing of the ADA. They were still struggling to get Congress to approve the ADA, and in March of 1990, advocates gathered at the Capitol, and you can go to the next slide. And this was considered the Capitol crawl that really pushed the Congress to eventually get the legislation to the president's desk and sign the Americans with Disabilities Act. Next slide. There was a lot of opposition, both from religious groups and also, next slide, a lot of opposition to the ADA. It wasn't easy to get it passed. The business community, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Federation of Independent Businesses, a lot of opposition to the ADA passing. They all thought it was going to be too expensive and a headache to business. But ultimately it was passed. And next slide. I think this is our last slide. But generally, I think what this shows is that, that's the signing of the ADA, President Herbert Walker Bush and Justin Dart next to him. Evan Kemp was on the left of him. Next slide. And I think, the one previous slide, what I wanted to show was that how the ADA, how it was truly, probably the most truly bipartisan piece of legislation, major piece of legislation ever to pass. It passed on 91-6 in the Senate. And thank you for having us. I hope this gave you a little bit of understanding of how the independent living movement impacted the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Phil. I really appreciate you and April joining us today. Now we got Rose Daly-Rooney from the Arizona Center for Disability Law. Rose, you want to introduce yourself and kick it off?
For disability law. I graduated law school in 1994, just 4 years after the ADA was signed into law, and I've been practicing law on behalf of people with disabilities in the area of disability law for the past 26 years. And I've been working with the ADA for a long time, and it is it's a wonderful law. So we're going to talk about a little bit of pre-ADA because I don't want to duplicate, and then a little bit of comparison to how it is with the Rehabilitation Act and why it was really an advancement of the rights of people with disabilities from the framework and the groundwork laid for Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Next slide. And okay, so before we start this, I'm just going to say one thing, and that is April told us about the sit-ins. I believe it was April, but told us about the sit-ins, and it really was a catalyst for change that led up to the ADA. As Phil said, it took a number of presidents to come and go, and the community was really disappointed with the administration for not doing what they needed to do and sign it, because the Rehabilitation Act itself, the law, was just an anti-discrimination remark, but the regulations, the rules gave it life and said what it is that government had to do, and recipients of federal financial assistance. So after the 28-day sit-in, this is when the group realized that they had success, and the public came to hear about it. So it's a nice end to what April and Phil were telling us. So go ahead and start the very short video.
5 million Americans, handicapped Americans, won a big victory today when HEW Secretary Joseph Califano signed.
Well, we won't worry. Well, we won't worry. Maybe we don't have enough to do that. I'm going to tell you where you can find this video, or
Kitty Cone.
The signing of the regulations signified the public birth of the disability rights movement. It ushered in an era of disability activism, empowerment, and legislative victories based on the legal concepts of non-discrimination and integration embodied in Section 504.
To the heroes that were inside and outside the building. Treehouse Video, San Francisco.
Move to the next slide. Actually, DREDF did that the Section 504, the power of Section 504. There's 2 videos. We had a little problem because you'd missed the middle. There was a few minutes of where looked at really the cross disability coalition that did that. There were people with mobility disabilities using wheelchairs. There were people who are deaf, people who are blind, people with intellectual disabilities. There were a really cross section of people at that sit-in, and there was a cross section of when you look at the videos, a cross section of people supporting them from outside. For example, food was brought to them by the Black Panthers, the Gray Panthers, a lot of the labor unions. So it's really a cross coalition and a cross disability coalition that resulted in administration finally signing those regulations. And as Phil had said, really before the Rehabilitation Act and before the ADA, the only protections that were available for people with disabilities were an array of very important litigation and legislation, but only affecting piecemeal parts of their life. Like the Rehabilitation Act only applied to government, state and local government, or other recipients of federal financial assistance. It really didn't hit into the private sector. And then the Voting Accessibility Act, that improved voting accessibility and a very important part of life, but didn't move to other things that people needed also, as well as in 1968, we had the Fair Housing Act, and 20 years later, it was finally extended to people with disabilities. So these were all kind of a patchwork, and we needed something comprehensive in order to really bring people into the mainstream. And this is the same photo that Phil showed, but it is a message from President Bush to Justin Dart, explaining how important he was to the process and to getting an ADA, because without the stories that he collected, and the information was also part of a congressional hearings, and those congressional hearings form the legislative history, and the stories that people told can be read in Westlaw and the different legal books available to us at ASU and on Westlaw and other legal services, to see what those stories were at the time. What were people facing at that time? And primarily it was the story of not being able to go into restaurants, not being able to go to hotels, not being able to travel because of the restrictions, not being able to find employment. So this is where the ADA proceeded to move the movement and the rights further and advance it. Next slide. This is what President Bush said on the signing of it. The act is powerful in its simplicity. It will ensure that people with disabilities are given the basic guarantees for which they have worked so long and so hard: independence, freedom of choice, control of their lives, the opportunity to blend fully and equally into the rich mosaic of the American mainstream. And you see that is the end. If it hadn't been for the independent living movement, I don't believe politicians at that time would have been enlightened enough at all to say something like that, how important it was. It was that background that led to the law being developed. And one thing I would say about the ADA, after working with it for 20 some years, it is powerful in its simplicity. It does set forth protections for people with disabilities, coverage, who's covered, who's not covered, what are the protections afforded, and those are written in a way that you can apply them to areas that Congress probably never contemplated. For example, you can apply it to, the Supreme Court applied the Americans with Disabilities Act to whether or not a golfer would be able to, a golfer with a physical disability would be able to have a exception to the cart rule and play in a pro game. But it also applies it to things like whether or not a person can get an accommodation at work, whether or not a person should get an interpreter at a doctor's office, a sign language interpreter. It moves into all different areas. And I teach disability law and I've taught it at ASU. And when students are confronted with a problem, it's like, just go back to the framework. It can always tell you the answer. There may be disagreement about what happens when you apply it to certain facts, but we have the framework to determine rights. Next slide. So the ways in which, these are the titles of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and I'm going to say that how it extended from the Rehabilitation Act. Previously, people with disabilities had rights with respect to employment if they applied for a state or local governmental entity or maybe an agency that received a federal grant. Otherwise, or maybe if they worked for a federal contractor, but otherwise they didn't have any employment rights. So the ADA expanded employment rights to both to the private sector and also to unions and to other employment agencies and temp agencies, etc. All of them were applied. Title II didn't make huge changes. It often mirrored what the Rehabilitation Act required. But Title III was the other area in which now places of public accommodation, so private businesses open to the public, those businesses and some of those organizations that fought so hard to prevent it, it was opened up to that people with disabilities should have access to the goods and services of a public accommodation. And then we have enforcement and remedies in this law, and it created a telecommunication system that would allow people with disabilities to not only connect with people who are deaf, to be able to connect with hearing people and use a relay system. The two important parts of the ADA are that there are two ways in which it helps people with disabilities. It says we can't treat people with disabilities differently than we treat other people, but we also we need to level the playground, and we need to, as April and them explained, we need to fix those things in society that make it difficult for a person to be with a disability to be able to get access to the goods and services, get jobs. So we need to provide sign language interpreters, or we need to provide Braille so that people can see printed material. We need to remove architectural barriers and communication barriers. So again, that tied to the independent movement. And one other very important thing that the ADA did is Congress made clear that as technology advances, so can what we expect, the requirements of what businesses, employers, and others might need to do is also expanding, because they are going to need, that means technology may allow for more meaningful and effective opportunities, and now we need to provide the accommodations that allow that. Also, as people with disabilities have learned, sometimes technology, unless it is modified or people with disabilities are taken into consideration in its design, it can also exclude people. So that is why there have been many cases on website accessibility, and courts have resoundingly agreed that the ADA applies to technology, accessibility to computers, etc., and other kinds of technology. And I'll give one more example. When tele-emergency services around the country could take text messages, then there was a drive to ask counties and governments to make text available for to 911 services, so that people who are deaf or who have a speech disability would be able to communicate in emergency services. So it is a very breathable law that can continue to serve people with disabilities and advance their rights. Next slide. In a very important date in the ADA's history, since it has been passed, is June 22nd, 1999, when the U.S. Supreme Court issued four decisions on the same day. One of them is considered to be one of the most significant and important advancements of the rights of people with disabilities, ruling that unjustified isolation of individuals with disabilities through undue institutionalization violates the ADA, and then a trio of cases that were decided that delivered a stunning blow to the ADA and limited its coverage by narrowing the meaning of disability, and really affected affected, this was particularly damaging to people seeking employment and also in people seeking to be students or in other professional ways. Next slide. We'll start with the victory, and that was Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg delivered that decision for the Supreme Court. It was Olmstead versus LC, and it has been, it asks the question of whether the ADA's integration mandate required placement of persons with mental disabilities in community settings rather than in institutions. Because as Phil said, there were a lot of Willowbrooks all around the country, and the effort was a lot of entities did not want to provide those community-based services that the independent living movement was seeking. Next slide. And the Supreme Court ruled in that case, and it was a qualified yes to that answer. And it was qualified in the saying that people with disabilities have a right to receive state-funded supports and services in the community and not in institutions, with some criteria. When the person's treatment professionals determine that community supports are appropriate, when the person does not object to living in the community, and the provision of services in the community will be a reasonable accommodation when you balance the other similarly situated individuals with disabilities. So that took into account people have rights to choice. It also took into account that it has to be, the services have to be appropriate. And the third thing it took into account is we were working under a system in other states, particularly more so in other states, where there were huge institutions, and there had to be a way to start delivering the services into community-based monies and still deal with individuals who need to be in the institutions. So it was a little bit of a compromise there, but it's still, Olmstead has been a miraculous decision. Next slide. And it has been used by creative lawyers and creative advocates, people with disabilities, and lawyers to take the Olmstead concept that if services should be provided in the community and not somewhere else whenever possible, and it's been applied to sheltered workshops to get more people with intellectual disabilities and similar serious physical disabilities out of sheltered workshops and into the community, nursing home facilities, institutions, children's services, and in Medicaid services in schools. And it is not, you can see Olmstead decisions are now being used with COVID to try to help people get in community-based services out of larger institutions where their risk of transmission and contracting it is much greater. So it is a very, it's been a very good tool for people with disabilities. Next slide. But when you talk about the ADA and what significant dates in its history, you do have to look at that blow that was suffered in 1999. And it really changed, as President Bush said, it was our definition of disability too was simple. This was it: physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, record of such an impairment, or regarded as having such an impairment. Those were three prongs. Any of those prongs someone could have proven. Under the Rehabilitation Act, it did not. It was disability was easily determined. It was broad coverage, and it was not much pushback on whether or not a person was disabled. But once that the decision came down from the Supreme Court, next slide, we started to see that case by the Supreme Court was used. Those three cases, Sutton, they're here, Sutton versus United Airlines, Murphy versus UPS, and Albertsons. And they basically they specifically, the court said, we don't think Congress intended to cover, a large group of people. We think this was supposed to be, this definition was supposed to be a gatekeeper to make sure that there weren't too many people being considered people with disabilities. This was the opposite of what civil rights law was. Civil rights law is broad coverage and exceptions are viewed narrowly. The court turned that on its, turned that around, and now people with disabilities had to fight to prove that they had a disability. And what the significance of this is, it meant that people spent so much time fighting for what, that they had a disability, that they never got to the issue of whether or not there was discrimination. Next slide. Specifically, what the court did was say, we're going to consider mitigating measures such as medication, mobility aids. We're going to consider everything that a person with a disability uses to mitigate, you know, to make them able to do things in the community and be able to live in the community. We're going to take all those things and we're going to say, oh, well, if you're a person with epilepsy and you take an anti-seizure medication and you only have one seizure every month, we're going to look at that's really a substantial limitation to any major life activity. And so it became, what happened was, is that they also made it, you had to have a severe restriction to substantial limitation or be unable to do something in order to be able to get this definition. We spent 3 or 4 classes in a disability law class talking about what Sutton did and the trio of cases, but it triggered many lower court decisions. Next slide. What happened in the years that followed that was that statistics show that more than 90% or better of cases, ADA cases brought up on, particularly in the employment area, were being lost before a person could even get to trial, because they were challenged on whether or not they had a disability and they lost, and they never got to trial on the merits of what happened to them. Additionally, it became so expensive, you needed experts to prove everything. It became so expensive that the private bar who was willing to take ADA cases dried up. They were not willing to take the risk and the expense of providing legal services to a person with a disability making this type of challenge. This meant that it was left to, you know, private nonprofits who could not meet everyone's needs. And it also meant that people stopped trying. You know, a lot of people gave up. There were a lot of lawyers out there making creative arguments and doing the best they could. But in those years, I had clients who had an intellectual disability that read at about the 2nd grade level. And I had challenges where they brought in experts saying that's not a disability for purposes of the ADA. People who were deaf and had cochlear implants, that's not a disability. People who were amputee and had used a prosthetic device, that's not a disability. People had HIV, not a disability. They were constantly, the defense bar was fighting those kinds of cases. Next slide. So after many years, with many partners, including some of the original drafters of the ADA, spent a number of years trying to work on a solution to basically write the ADA by restoring the broad meaning of disability. And coincidentally, then it is the next President Bush, that signed the ADA Amendment Act of 2008, which restored the broad meaning of ADA. And in fact, Congress said, if you read the text of the law, it says, we're undoing, they use more legalese words, but we're undoing what the Supreme Court did. We reject those findings. That is not what was intended. These actions intend to restore the ADA. Next slide. And as Phil said, there was tremendous bipartisan support. Again, we see a cross-disability coalition, and we also see a bipartisan support once again for that. I think now, if we had if we had to pass an ADA or change something to restore something in the ADA, how hard it would be in the current climate, because there was an opportunity, there were opportunities there, and people were partnering together and working to solve these. I want to pass the baton to the next person because I want to make sure everybody has time. So I will skip these. These were just some of the improvements that were made to restore the ADA, and that information is available on the slides. And as we already said, one of our other presenters said, then the ADA rules were amended in 2010 to provide more services for to provide more guidance for businesses and government about how to provide for people in the community to make sure that they have their rights realized. And so more changes were made to improve effective communication, make sure there were rules about service animals and their ability to be in places of public accommodation in government, dealing with things that technology required Congress to deal with, like now there were power-driven mobility aids, as we saw on the first slide, and there needed to be ticketing and reservation systems so that people with disabilities who now had more access could reserve accessible rooms, etc., or accessible seating in a sporting arena. So a lot of changes were made to keep up with the times. And now I'll pass it on to our next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Rose. I wanted to remind everybody who's listening, this entire presentation in its entirety and the video will all be on the registration page in the next day or two. So if you need to go back and check some of the information, it'll be there for you. Susan, would you like to join us now and talk about some employment services?
Yes, can you go ahead to my slides, please?
Oh, there we go. I'm trying. There you go.
My name is Susan Webb, and I am retired as Vice President of Ability 360 Employment Services. And as has been discussed throughout, the ADA itself and the Rehab Act were the laws that Congress and the President said, this is what you do. But the regulations, whether they be for 504 or the ADA, that's where the devil's in the details. That's how the federal government is told to implement the provisions that are within the law. And those regulations make a huge difference. And so Title I of the ADA is about all of the employment provisions that employers shall not discriminate against an individual with a disability in hiring and training and promoting qualified individuals with disabilities. So where the ADA, I think, is particularly beautiful is the fact that it did not give a laundry list to define disability. Rose talked about the definition of disability and how the Supreme Court kind of screwed it up for us. And that a lot of that applied to employment, in that if you brought a suit that the employer did not treat you properly under the ADA, then first you had to prove that you had a significant physical or mental improvement or mental impairment that significantly limit one or more of life's major activities, had a history of such an impairment, or were regarded as having such an impairment. Now that's a broad definition intended to give wide latitude to you meeting the definition of a disability rather than a laundry list, because we know there are just thousands and thousands of different types of disabilities. And as April pointed out, along the continuum of each one, each of us is affected differently. So the idea was then that with the employment provisions, there was another layer of complexity that was put on top of the general definition. And that is, are you otherwise qualified for the job? Do you have the knowledge, the skills, the abilities, education, or experience to do the job for which you are applying? So in order to be considered for a job, your disability essentially was supposed to be ignored. That was the idea, that we're not going to pay attention to the disability as long as you are otherwise qualified, having the KSAEs that are needed for the job. And then On that same note, the second part of that test was, can you perform the essential functions of the job? And that means the employer is required to make sure that the job description that they wrote only includes the tasks that are actually required for the job, and not tasks that might eliminate a person with a disability from even being considered on the face of it, such as you'll see job descriptions that say must lift 50 pounds when there's no reason that that particular job would require anyone to lift 50 pounds. But because many people with disabilities can't lift that much, they were systemically left out. Another one we see commonly is must have a valid Arizona driver's license. Well, if the job doesn't require driving, why would there be a requirement for an Arizona driver's license? And yet many people with disabilities do not have a valid Arizona license because they don't drive. So that was another type of discriminatory behavior in job descriptions that tended to leave people out. So the ADA requires that employers stop that and perform and actually define what are the actual job requirements necessary. Now, if you are another otherwise qualified individual with a disability and you can perform the essential functions of the job, then you made the test. But what if you can't? What if there is some element of the job that you cannot perform due to your disability? Well, then the law says that if you can perform the job with or without one or more reasonable accommodations. And a reasonable accommodation meant that it can be performed without much difficulty or expense based on the size of the business and the resources that they have available to do the job. So that's kind of a mouthful. You have to be an otherwise qualified individual who, with or without a reasonable accommodation, can perform the essential functions of the job. Now, within that confine, if you think about the definition that Rose talked about with the significant physical or mental condition that prevents that affects one or more of life's major activities, a history of or regarded as, that's what happened where the courts were saying, well, wait a minute, if you don't meet that test, whether the employer failed to accommodate you or hire you is irrelevant because you have no standing. And as she pointed out, more than 90% of cases brought for employment discrimination were summarily dismissed before even talking about what the employer did that was discriminatory behavior. So that's why the ADA Amendments Act in 2008 was so important, because it brought back the broader definitions so that now if you meet these other requirements of employment, then you do have the protections and can be heard. Now, one of the biggest problems today with these provisions, as good as they are, the whole idea of disability disclosure became an issue. Many people believed it was necessary to disclose that you have a disability, and the opposite is true. As I said, if you are qualified, otherwise qualified, and you can perform the essential functions of the job, why would you be required to talk about your disability at all? Because the idea behind it is for your disability to be irrelevant. Can you perform the job? That's it. And yet many people were being asked about their disability in terms of disclosure. And the whole idea here is that it is irrelevant unless an accommodation is needed. And that whole reasonable accommodation thing has become quite a morass. And I will say that after all my years of practicing employment with people who have disabilities, all aspects of employment, which has been more than 25 years, I can tell you that so often accommodations are needed. And if an accommodation is needed, the focus should be on the job task, not the disability. But that's not what we see in practice very often. So an employer may ask if you have a disability, but for affirmative action purposes, that is to screen you into a job, not to screen you out of the job. And they cannot ask you ever about the nature of your disability. And this is also where we get into trouble, because now they're allowed to ask for affirmative action purposes, and employers who are federal contractors are actually required to ask you. There's a specific form that they have to use. but it only asks whether you have a disability and not what the disability is. And it's important for employers and employees, whether you're applying for a job or whether you're on the job, that your disability and the nature of the medical condition itself is not relevant, and you should not be talking about that. If there's some problem with getting the job done, and the job is written according to the essential functions, then in fact, the disclosure issue, you must disclose that you have a disability, but you need to focus on what it is about the job, just as we talked about with the physical requirements in the community, being about the community and making the community friendly. It's the same in employment. It's about making the job friendly, not about highlighting what's wrong with the person. And that's where we're getting into a lot of trouble with employment today. And I think that employers are well-meaning, but when Phil talked about the independent living movement and demedicalizing it, that has not been the case in, now, can you go back to the other slide? You went ahead of me there. That has not been the case in employment. In employment, what has happened is that the medical model trumps everything. And what we're going to talk about is that when you get into that situation where you're doing the job and something comes up, then in fact, a reasonable accommodation is needed. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So go ahead and go to that next slide for me. And lest you think that reasonable accommodations on the job occur infrequently, I can tell you that is absolutely not the case. It is very frequent this happens. But much attention is focused on accessible technology or assistive technology for employees with sensory conditions. And there is considerable information and support available about technology at the Arizona Technology Access Program, or ASTAP, at astap.org. And so they are a great resource, and I've used them extensively on several occasions. If there is a technology issue, then the ASTAP is a great resource to be brought in for both the employee and the employer to look at the accommodation that might be necessary to enable this person to perform the essential function of the job, and to do it in a cost-effective way. I need you to go back to the other slide, please. Okay, but most accommodations are not about technology. And I will tell you that every single accommodation is unique and must be managed by the requesting employee. Just as with the independent living movement and us controlling our lives, the same is true with controlling our jobs. The workplace focus has to be on the job tasks, because you as the person with a disability are the only one who truly knows that disability, not someone else. And you are the one doing the job, not someone else. And so there's a requirement then that there be an interactive process, and the next slide will go into that in a little more detail. But it's really important that the employer and the employee work together, because it is the employee who has the disability, and the focus needs to be on the job, not the disability. So there are resources for help with those types of situations at the Job Accommodation Network, and I've got the website listed there, askjan.org, and then the Specific Disability and Business Technical Assistance Center, I've got their website there, and then of course guidance is very plentiful at the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and they have a lot of guidance ad nauseum about how to interpret the ADA and its implementing regulations. So when things come up at the job, either before you are offered the job or when you are on it, because I will tell you, most accommodation requests become evident after you're on the job, not before. It is true that if you have a disability that that has technology needs, like blindness or deafness in particular, then there are certain technology needs that need to be accommodated up front. But most accommodations are not those, and most accommodations occur after the actual job you're on the actual job. So let's go to the next slide and talk about that process real quickly, because I too want to get to the other speakers. So most accommodations are requested on the job due to changes in the job itself, or the employee acquires something different during their employment. Their condition changes in some way, or they actually acquire a condition that they didn't have when they first started work there. Now, when there is an accommodation request, most employers do have an ADA accommodation request procedure. Unfortunately, it often relates to hearing from the doctor. They will trot out the medical form that you want. They need you to go to the doctor and have the doctor validate your need for this accommodation. And this is where the medicalization of the ADA and the Title I provisions are quite honestly rampant. I have delivered trainings. I am a senior certified professional, a certified senior professional in human resources, have been for many, many years, have trained hundreds of human resource professionals in all kinds of industries. And the insistence on the doctor's note is pervasive. The problem is that when you get the doctor's note, what does it say? It doesn't give you the information you need to do the accommodation. Why? Because the doctor doesn't know the job. The doctor knows medicine, and this is where I'm talking about with medicalization. So it's really important that the ADA EEOC regulations do require the employer to invoke an interactive process such that they must communicate with each other. The employer and the employee must communicate with each other about what needs to be done, how it's to be done, and when. Now, although both of these processes seem to are logical, that would be that everybody wants to do them together, but they do get mixed up in the process because of the insistence on the doctor intervention, and it does create a problem. So instead, let's go to the next slide, please. So, no, that's the same one. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, so the focus needs to, no, back to the other one. This is my last slide. Okay, boy, these are really blurry for me. I don't know if they are for everyone else, so you need to keep the focus on the job tasks that need to be accommodated, not the disability. And the employer might ask you to fill out a HIPAA waiver. That's your HIPAA privacy against medical information being distributed, and never sign a HIPAA waiver. Medical information is simply not needed, because what is it going to do? It's going to define your disability by a medical diagnosis. And as April pointed out so eloquently early on, the medical diagnosis is such a broad spectrum of where you fall within that diagnosis that it gives hardly any good information. You have to be the one to supply the information about how is my job affected and what can be done so that I can perform the job. Now, some of the things that are contemplated in the EEOC guidance has to do with modifying the job and giving some tasks to other employees and more tasks that you can do, rescheduling your job, and these are the ones that I've seen more often than anything. Things like, I need more breaks, more bathroom breaks, or I need to, oh, there's a timer on my slide. I'm getting a note from Peter. Okay, I'm almost done anyway. But they need to have the more bathroom breaks, or their workstation needs to be close to a bathroom, or maybe they need to take more time off for a doctor's appointment. Things like that seem very simple to do, And I mean to tell you, you start getting the doctor involved in that kind of stuff instead of using common sense, and it becomes an absolute nightmare. So again, those resources I gave you should help if you run into this situation, because honestly, I don't think employers are being mean-spirited or not trying to help. They feel obligated to help. The problem is that they don't help. Because they're looking for the doctor to tell them what needs to be done, and the doctor can't tell them. The doctor knows medicine, not the job. So I think you see the problem there, but it can be worked with as long as the individual with the disability does keep control, both the employer and the employee focus on the job tasks, and you use the resources that are out there that I've given you. So it's up to the employee then to research your own accommodation, that using these resources that I gave you, and using that resource to go ahead and negotiate with the employer. And in my experience, it works really well, and the employer appreciates it. And those are how you get good outcomes within the unintended consequences of the regulations as written. That completes my presentation today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, Susan. I really appreciate it. We're going to move on now to Director of Technology Accessibility, Terry Hedgepeth. Terry, introduce yourself and then kick it off.
All right, hang on just a minute here.
I'm going to try to advance the slide too.
Yes, please start the slide.
There we go.
I'll start with the bio. Now I got to trust you to be on it because I can't visually track what if you're behaving. So
everything I can, thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to give a little bit of history about me first, just to kind of give you a perspective on, well, a perspective on my perspective. So oddly enough, it was my disability first off, is I'm totally blind as a result of retinal blastoma. Ooh, I just disclosed. I don't have a problem with that in cases like this. So I was been blind since I was 2 and went to public schools from day one. No special attendant sitting next to me, talking to me and such. I did have what they call a resource teacher that I would meet with for one period every day, that she would braille in those days they called them dittos, the ditto sheets that the teachers were going to hand out for assignments, and she would write, transcribe my braille assignments so the teachers could grade them. So talk about a fully immersive experience. And I had all the same textbooks that my sighted classmates had, but mine were in braille, right down to the Sally, Dick, and Jane reader, to one of my favorites in high school, the biology book with all the raised diagrams. You know, ooh, look, it's the human genetic, or the human genitalia, you know, things that entertain a teenager. What can I say? Education started with that. It went to public schools right here in Phoenix, and up in the Sunny Slope area. They were amazing. They were far ahead of my time, or their time, or I should say the ADA for sure, and the 504. So I started first grade in '64, and I mention that only because it's relevant in how forward thinking they were. And they set the pace of my expectations of what accommodations should be. I truly was fully integrated. So I had that expectation early on. And when I got into high school and we started doing these little career exploration things, and as I got a bit further on, I think probably my sophomore year, I realized that my other blind people that I knew who were graduating from high school were going to places like ASU or whatever. And they were dealing with having their textbooks on tape. And at that point, it was barely cassette tape. Some were reel to reel. And I'm like, wait a minute. I have had a full I had all my books in Braille. I had raised line diagrams and maps and tape. So I did not go to college from 76 until 86 because I could not deal with that thought. I just couldn't wrap my head around how would I deal with college subject level courses if I had to listen to it on a cassette tape. And I heard another blind person years ago giving a presentation. He likened cassette tapes, a textbook on cassette tapes would be like sighted people having their textbook printed on rolls of toilet paper. And so you would have to unroll that roll until you could get to the sheet that you needed, that you had to start reading from. So imagine that. And that honestly is not too far off. So I worked for that 10 years in food service. I learned a lot, had fun, but then I had a son, and I wanted to have a job that would pay me well enough so that I could buy a house and he would have a backyard. To me, that was my big goal. And so from that point on, I decided I need to go to college. And since I had a family here, ASU was it. And I went there and I met some of the most wonderful staff in the disability office. Teddy Scharf and Jay Tasca. He was the DAC then for the blind and visually impaired. And he was so cool. He had all this hippie stuff on his walls and he would tell us all about it. And we just had a lot of fun. And he made it what is potentially really stressful time in terms of access in college and going into such an unfamiliar environment. He made it so much easier and so much more pleasant. So I finished my degree, my Bachelor of Science in Psychology. I did a Master's in Social Work Administration. From early on, I was always the big picture systems person that wanted to make a difference for a larger group of people. I felt like one-on-one is great, but I wanted to be able to do something for larger groups all at once. And I wanted that to be somewhere in the line of accessibility, be that students with disabilities, or maybe it's students without disabilities that have other difficulties. So that leads into my passion for accessibility for students. In my work history, briefly, I worked at ASU now for 26 years. Starting in '94, I was a disability access consultant in the disability office for 10 years. And during that 10 years, for about the first 6, I helped set up and initiate and run the disability office alternative format lab. That's what we called it then. And that is something that, again, passion, because I was able to provide something to our students that they have not been able to readily get. Just, only like 3 years before I started working there. Another passion I've always had is anytime I'm in a position where I have staff positions under me, if you will, I've always focused on hiring people with disabilities wherever I can. And I have hired at least 18 professional staff with disabilities and 18 student workers with disabilities for internships in computer science when I was in computer science faculty.
Terry,
Uh-huh.
we're running way behind. Is there any way you can start on your history of blindness?
Sure.
Thanks.
Sure. So, and we'll go to the slide here with the Randolph-Shepard Act, 1936. And this is kind of going through the history of blindness as we kind of build up to, as Phil and April built that to. So in the blindness arena, 1936 was what we call the vending program. So that allowed established these facilities like in the post office, there would be, cigarettes vendor, sandwiches, things like that. And usually the Randolph-Shepard Act made it mandated that federal facilities hire blind individuals or put blind individuals in these facilities to run that, to give to give productive employment options for people who are blind. And they established a program to run that. So next slide, 1938, that kicked off the Sheltered Workshop Act. That's just what I call it. It was a Wagner-O'Day Act, and that's a hard one, okay? So people, maybe they got to come off of the corners and quit selling pencils, but really a sheltered workshop. Honestly, for instance, I'll just give you an example, when minimum wage was $2 an hour, you could be making 10 to 20 cents in a sheltered workshop. It's almost equivalent to prison wages. So let's go to the next slide. 1971 became the Javits-Wagner-O'Day Act. It was updated to include private organizations still hiring people with disabilities and establishing organizations in the sheltered workshop realm like Goodwill. And then in 2006, the Javits-Wagner-O'Day Act was renamed Ability One. So in this next slide, we can skip. So
I'm keeping up with you. Go ahead.
okay. So in 1977, rules were changed so that service dogs or guide dogs in those days were allowed on the floor in Congress, in the United States Congress. This is interesting because they legalized the service dogs or guide dogs could be allowed in public buildings back in, I think it was the late 1930s. So yeah, it was good enough for everyone else, but not them. And by the way, that's very common in the federal government. What's good for you isn't necessarily what we go by. Okay, in 1982 and 1984, in that realm, ASU added aggregate tactile borders to all the mall walkways at that time. And what this allowed is that for someone who's blind to track the texture, to know, as you're walking along, you could track that. And when you came upon smooth part, that either meant there was an entrance to the building there or it was an intersecting sidewalk. So it was just like a neat, really thoughtful idea. And, something like it, ASU was ahead of itself. In 1978, the ASU and the city of Temp started installing audible signals at crosswalks, intersections. This was prompted by student requests, which is so cool. Students have so much power and people with disabilities as well to get things done and get actions. I can just say on that, be solution oriented, offer solutions. Don't be, this is not working for me, fix it. Next slide. In 1987, a group of students, 8 students who were blind, all went to meet with the library dean for Hayden Library at the time. And we wanted an ADA room that was staffed, that we could get assistance. Now, remember in 87, library was still central to what a student did in college. We still had the card catalog, which it was print, okay? They did have a room for those people. It was in the sub-basement in way in the off back area, and lighting was extremely poor. Their thoughts were, well, it's probably mostly blind people that use it. They don't really need the lighting. So no thoughts for any other disabilities, which is just wild. So now the dean did say yes to that proposal, and she established in the new library facility that was built at that time, which on the Hayden lawn, right underneath the Nipple of Knowledge is the nickname that we call it at ASU. They established an ADA room and staffed it with full-time library staff, so that if you were the person with a disability and needed assistance pulling books and journals or finding things, they were right there to help, which was really cool. How did DRC's alt format start? Well, in 1989, I was an undergrad at that point, and I had to pass college math. I could not do college math on tape. Sorry, it wasn't going to work. So I found the local salesman for a particular tech company, assistive technology company, and arranged him to come with me to the DRC to meet with the then director, Teddy Sharp, and the associate director, Richard Jones. And I proposed to them that they should start an alt format media or alt format lab for students who are blind to produce Braille for textbooks. And if nothing else, start with the STEM books. In a week's time of consideration, the director of the disability office said yes. And they used funding from the senior class in 1988 to kick that off. So how cool is that? Next slide. I will skip this slide because you guys have been ADA'd to death here. But no, well, there's one other thing on here. 1991 in that slide, I mentioned here, the tactile warning bumps were added to subway platforms and train platforms. And this became an issue because there were a number of blind people, including blind people with dogs, that were literally pushed off of these subway platforms by people crowding them in and pushing them out of their way. Tragically, some died, some were injured, and some were able to be rescued without injury. Next slide now. 1992, Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. They accepted this young woman who was totally blind into their university, and when she requested her notes be converted into Braille and that she be given tools to access the university's library facilities or assistance in some way, and that things like this that were already happening at ASU at this point. Her father sued Loyola Marymount, and they won. And the uniqueness about this case is it established case law under the ADA for post-secondary institutions. It was also a major influence on ASU's DRC at the time and post-secondary institutions across the nation. Next slide. In 1994, ASU, the DRC, the signage shop, and some other, I don't remember who the other staff were, but another department, established and built a tactile wall map for people who are blind and visually impaired. And I noticed that Kelly Nimick is in the audience, and she was key to that. She is the one that actually produced those maps on a plastic kind of material with a router. Amazing, absolutely amazing. Then in 1996, a massive project was launched to start putting Braille signage, interior Braille signage, at all rooms in ASU. And there was a person that was really worked hard on this kind of stuff, including the wall map. Her name was Jean Alley, and she worked in Peter's position where he is now. Amazing woman. I can't tell you how many men's bathrooms I went in with her to measure this stall and make sure that the turning radius for a wheelchair and the stall was correct, and she was amazing. 1998 revised the statute in Arizona requiring publishers who sold any textbooks to universities or community colleges in Arizona that they had to provide an electronic version to the university or college. I was a part of that. I testified before the legislature to get that passed, and I can't tell you once it passed how many faculty from the community colleges called me and just were furious that this would be passed, that I was encroaching on their academic freedom. And that was part of several people, Jane Aaron from the U of A, Foundation for Blind Children. So a lot of people worked on that. And in 1998, and they kind of covered this already, President Clinton then signed in the amendments for the 504. So you talk about how long, that was ridiculous. Okay, in section 508, I'll just briefly color that. That covers the electronic information technology in the federal government and to be made accessible to people with disabilities. And I know that one of the issues that kicked this off in Arizona is the legislature put in place a system of, I guess you'd call them dumb clients on a computer system, that you were required to access and sign up if you wanted to speak to the legislature or any committees. Well, guess what? They weren't accessible, and they didn't provide anyone to assist people with disabilities to use those. Okay, next slide. So in 2002, the Help America Vote Act came into place, and they started working on approaching accessibility of voting machines, and it was an exciting time. So that took quite a while, actually. I mean, I would say probably good 10 to 13 years after that was passed before that was fully realized across the United States. Of course, the mail-in ballots are still not accessible, just saying. 2006, the National Federation filed a lawsuit against Target and won. And what they filed against is the online Target site was not fully accessible. And in particular, they couldn't check out and purchase an item. They couldn't complete a purchase. Next slide. In 2008, so late, the Treasury decided that they would start working on making US currency, paper money accessible to people who are blind and visually impaired. That still hasn't happened, by the way. The solution they have put into place is they hand out free bill identifiers. So these little handheld things that you can hold to currency, and it'll tell you what the currency, what that bill is. Wow, really? Now, I'm going to cover this briefly. I know that others have covered it a little bit, but in 2008 is when the ADA was amended. And there were three really kind of key things that came out of that. It broadened the scope of who is disabled, and Sue covered that already. So I won't spend too much on that. So, you know, the disability, if you had something that wasn't permanent, or if it was just not something that fell into that tight little definition that the original ADA had. So it definitely opened that up. It was a really good thing. The second significant change was what qualifies as a service animal. Now, by 2008, everybody was having a service thing. And I say that because we had service lizards, service birds, service snakes. This is my, pardon me. Let's see, did they have turtles? All kinds of things. There is even a student, a blind student, that had a horse, a service horse that would ride them to class in another institution back east. And they were demanding a place that the institution had to board the horse for them while they were in class, and it was a mess, literally. Now, what this amendment did is it specified that only dogs, and in some cases, miniature horses, are qualified service animals, period. So it really did tighten that down. And the third important thing is emotional support animals were no longer covered under the ADA, though they are still covered under the Fair Housing Act.
Well,
So that's about it.
Yep. We got a couple more people on board, so I hope people will stick around and go a little overtime with us. Just like any good football game, we're going to go into overtime. And thank you, Terry. I appreciate your help and time today. And Sherry Collins, would you jump in here with your segment?
Hello, everyone. Waiting for my slide to show up. Okay, I'm going to kind of go through some of the slides very quickly because of the timing, and also because everyone will have access to this video and the PowerPoint. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. And I want to introduce myself real quickly. My name is Sherry Collins. I'm the Executive Director of the Arizona Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. I have been in this position since 1998. So I've been around in Arizona for a long time. And also I have been involved, well, not the original, but the beginning of the ADA when it passed 30 years ago when we talk about the relay service. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But I want to highlight some of the history that people may not realize in Arizona. Before the ADA law was passed, many of you probably know Valley Center for the Deaf or Community Outreach Program for the Deaf in Tucson under Catholic Services. They had provided relay service using volunteers, meaning someone, a hearing person would type for a deaf person when they had to make calls, interpreting calls for deaf and hard of hearing people. So that happened way before, it was in the 1970s, early 80s when that happened. So I thought that's important to share with you that that access was already provided through volunteer services. And I'm not going to get into details because there's just a lot of stories that I wanted to add into my presentation because I was involved. I know what life is like as a deaf person. I was born deaf, what access means to me before the ADA law was passed. So I'm going to go on to the next slide because some of the pictures that I show will probably bring some of the memories back in the old days back then when we had AOL account, the instant message was very popular in our community. It was a good way to connect with the hearing community and also our deaf, friend or family member. And back then we had the bulky pager Wintel, and it became a small number pager. I remember when my husband and I had that pager without letters, we had a code, whatever, like 777 means this, means that, because we couldn't type a message to each other. So it's just so many technology had involved that we really rely on in our community who are deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf blind community. As I mentioned, the relay service, telecommunication access, that's part of the ADA. Actually, it's Title V. I was wrong. Sorry about that. I overlooked that error. And I was involved in the beginning of the request for proposal for relay service in the state of Florida. And that was a good experience. And in Arizona, as part of the ADA requirements to provide relay service, in other words, people know it as a 711, our office, Arizona Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, is responsible to oversee and provide relay service for the state of Arizona. Sprint is our current provider that provides relay services. And I'm going to keep on going because of the time. These are the two logos that we use. I want to go back a little bit real quick. The two logo relay services, that includes not just the traditional relay service that many of you are probably already familiar with, but one of the things that we do provide that is not required by the telecommunication relay services is the RCC. It's called Relay Conference Captioning. That is a feature for hard of hearing people who can participate on conference calls that will provide captioning during conference calls. So it's called RCC. If you're interested in learning more about that information, you can go into our website or call our office. We'll be happy to give you more information. Next slide. These are some of the app technology that is available that we rely on in our community who are deaf and hard of hearing. And there's a whole list, but some of these are the most common apps that our community really likes to use for captioning or, to type notes back and forth. Otter, Ava, Live, Transcribe, Notes, and captions. This is just a few examples that you can download apps on your phone. Next slide. This is something that I really wanted to emphasize to share with everybody. We have launched, our office has launched employment campaign is focusing on getting deaf, hard of hearing, and deaf blind people jobs. And that is an issue with all members in the disability community. So we just launched our campaign, and you will see our website information. Hopefully we can educate the employer about the different communication strategy, communication assets, but oftentimes we hear it's expensive to hire an interpreter. It is expensive to provide captioning. Actually, it's not true. There are so many technology and resources available and low cost to provide communication access to our community. So you might want to check out our website and get more information about our employment campaign. Next slide. As we are going through some challenging time with COVID-19, several things that has been a challenge in the beginning is what we're doing right now is Zoom. What's really nice now, we can pin an interpreter on the Zoom so we don't have to look for the interpreter when there are many, many people on Zoom calls. So that is just a new latest feature that has been added on Zoom. Also include captioning when you're using Zoom. The other challenge is telehealth. It's communication access for our community, because you're not allowed to go in to visit your doctor or receive medical care. Telehealth is really important, and we have to make sure that these medical providers understand that the access needs to be available for those who require medical care. Next slide. Next. Maybe there's a delay. Okay. You might see this. You might notice there's iPads in Sky Harbor Airport that just allow us to have access to communication, telecommunication services. And that's one of my staff who provided training. And you might want to look for that when it's safe to travel. Next slide. What are the future asset challenges that we're facing or concerned about? There are several, and that can really get into that, but I'm not going to do that today. But I listed some of this on the PowerPoint for you. Might want us to look into that. And also, our office can provide workshop training on all kinds of different areas, such as communication access, sensitivity training, and we can provide more in-depth information. For example, the new technology is out is called speech recognition. In other words, we don't have to have a person who's typing, captioning, translating the relay service through captioner as in the middle person. It could be all speech recognition. And that's, which is a great technology, but it's not accurate. Captioning is not accurate. For example, if you would notice YouTube, when you see a video and it's a beta and it automatically translates into captioning, but those captioning are not accurate. So we're really concerned about the latest technology because it's not accurate. And it's important that people understand that. Don't rely on automated speech recognition without checking the accuracy of the captioning. And also avatar, you might see more and more avatar like a kiosk. If you need to get information, we don't need an interpreter. Avatar might be able to give you information that you need. That is a whole new level of communication asset. And I mentioned in the other slide, it's the talking apps as well. So those are I'm just going to wrap up. I really went really quickly because of the time, and hopefully that if you're interested in learning more about our community on communication access, we're here to provide any information, and can always follow us on our Facebook page, Instagram, and Twitter, and our website. So thank you for the opportunity. It was a really fast presentation.
Sherry, your office is always very good and they work great with the community. So I encourage everybody to reach out to you. Your contact information will be shared shortly, as will all of our presenters. We have one more to go. And hold on and let's see the future of the ADA with May Ling, and she'll tell us all about cognition and what's coming up.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Peter. And my name is Mei Ling Chan, and I really want to say it's such a great honor to be here with this panel, along with amazing presenters from Ability 360 Center, Arizona Center for Disability Law, and the Arizona Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. So I'm going to bring it home. I'm going to go through these slides pretty quickly because I know we're over our time. I am also an alum of Arizona. I achieved my Master of Science in Communication Disorders in 2006, and I was a return student. And so I did see a lot of those new changes that you guys have been talking about on the campus in Tempe. So I am the Director of Growth and Achievement for Cognition, and it is a company that's based in Santa Barbara, California, and we are really on the cutting edge of technology. And I think this is why Peter invited us to share a little bit about what we see as the history of AAC and also the future. And I'm going to go through this really quickly for you. Go ahead, next slide, Peter. Thank you. For anyone that has had any experience with AAC, I mean, it really does date back really, really far. I mean, there is an inception of like in the 1920s when we started to get into something a little bit more technical, but definitely with sign language and gestures, this is something that's been used forever. A lot of people have been exposed to the picture communication symbols, and so we're calling this kind of like the beginnings of no tech, where you just have a picture and it represents something. And then we move into low tech. We call that kind of the hamburger switch. You can click it and you have a vocalization. And then going into mid tech, where you're kind of merging the pictures along with some type of technology. Then we have digital, and that was when the iPads came on. And that was just an amazing opportunity. And it also gave parents and children easier access. There's a whole big conversation we can have about independent education plans, IEPs, and who's responsible to provide these types of technologies to people to help them to communicate. But the becoming of the tablet really made it, I think, more financially viable for schools to be able to do this. And then also for parents, who did have the ability to financially acquire this and to get an app. And then the next exciting spaces is the wearable. And so you see this cap on here, and it's responding to EEG, which is the energy that is coming off of the brain. And then the last one is a little bit of a frightening picture, but it's an implant, and you can actually see where it's going into the brain. And I don't know how much exposure you have had, but we are definitely moving into the future with AAC. Let's go to the next slide. We'll talk a little bit about this on a broader scale. Thank you. So when we're looking at what is this going to be like for everyone, we definitely are starting in the area of disability, but we're looking towards communities, buildings, infrastructure, cities that actually respond to you whether or not you have a disability. And that's really exciting. You may have seen any of this exposure, within movies. There's a lot of I guess like Star Wars references and things like that actually do come to fruition. But this is really built on the need for accessibility and technology. And so we're calling them smart cities, working on universal design, having sensors that actually respond to you. And then also we're worried about HIPAA compliance and your own information. And I'm sure that everybody, thinks about that, like with your credit card, that's digital and that can be captured. That we're getting into facial recognition and just really exciting things. We'll go to one more slide. Thank you. So this is very, very exciting. When we talk about accessibility, we're talking about wearable devices. And so this is something that actually goes on your head, and it has what's called augmented reality or heads-up display. We may be seeing that in the gaming industry. We're pulling that obviously into accessibility and communication. Very, very exciting. That's the space that Cognition is in, working with brain-computer interface. We also have the Internet of Things, and so we have Alexa, and now we can use our AAC device. We actually have an app called Speak Pros with Cognition that integrates with Alexa. It's going to be launching in the next couple of weeks, and we can turn things on, turn things off, get information, you name it. Anything that Alexa can do, we can integrate. And so that's really fascinating and exciting. And then also apps that are adapting to your brain. So there are apps that can get information and let you know if you're experiencing depression or anxiety, and data collection. And then there's language that adapts to your situation. So like geolocation, and when you go into a certain location, that you'll be able to access vocabulary that's specific to that. So that's very, very exciting. And then the voices, I don't know if you guys have heard, but celebrities have been recording their voices, and people can use them as their voice on assistive technology devices. That's been really exciting. There's just so many amazing things that we're doing with machine learning, algorithms, just all these great words. And we're starting to use these technologies in our specific space of communication. So if you have any questions, please contact us at Cognition. Like I said, we do have the Speak Pros app that actually uses the iPad, and it uses the TrueDepth camera to allow eye tracking and facial recognition to control the iPad. So that's really, really exciting. And like I said, we're also working in the space of brain-computer interface and augmented reality. So thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of this and to bring the whole conference home and kind of talk about where we're going in the future.
May, you did a wonderful job. I'm excited for our future. There's some amazing stuff that you have going. I wish we could have spent another hour just on that because I'm a technology guy and I love that kind of stuff. So I want to thank everybody who presented. As we close here, I want you to see that we have the contact information for all of our presenters. They will scroll through, but they will also be available afterwards and be sent out in an email with the final presentation all ready to go and for everyone to watch again. We can't wait to have you back for our next event in the next month for the student recreation event, and then in the spring for the human resources. As this slides close out and as they scroll through, there is one last little piece that I hope you'll stick around for, and it's a memorial to people that we've lost over the last 30 years or more, who are very instrumental in the ADA here in Arizona, people who really made a difference for people with disabilities. Their slides are coming up here, and I really hope you'll watch them as you sign off and say goodnight. Thanks everybody for attending.